Greetings all, Dr. Raphael X here with Grayson Quay. I hope I pronounced his name right. Thank you very much for coming
You
on.
got it.
And
Yeah, thanks for having me.
before anything else, let us begin with the sign of the cross. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, the transhumanist temptation. Well, please subscribe, click on the like button, all that good stuff. The What is the transhumanist temptation? Very interesting book that Grayson Quay wrote. How technology and ideology are shaping humanity and how to resist. So I kind of like how he applies transhumanism or sees transhumanism in many different aspects of human life. You kind of do like a ideological recall, like a trans course in different periods, time periods, and again in different elements of human life, like in biology and all that. So basically, if you could, what brought you to write that book? What is transhumanism and what is a lot of questions here, and what is that temptation? What is that ultimate, if we could sum that up? Yeah.
Yeah, so what made me write this book was I've always been interested in a bunch of different things. I've been freelance writing kind of on and off since 2016, and I never really settled into a particular beat. I always kind of had varied interests. I was really interested in, bioethical issues, and those kinds of things. I was really interested in kind of emerging virtual technologies and question how that raised questions about like human embodiment and how we sort of are being in the world as we transition from being embodied to being more virtual beings. I was really interested in the whole kind of post-liberalism movement that arose a few years ago around Patrick Deneen and Gladden Papin and figures like that. I'm really interested in kind of new right economics, the sort of work that the American Compass think tank and stuff like that is doing to kind of reorient the discourse around economics on the American right. And then I was also really interested in kind of, the sort of re-enchantment, kind of religious discourse with figures like Rod Dreher and Jonathan Pageau and people like that. And one day, I was thinking about potential book topics because I really wanted to try to tackle a book, but I was struggling to think of what I wanted to write about. And I thought, I think there's actually a through line between all of these things. And I think that through line is transhumanism. I think that, all the first two are kind of obvious that you have these bioethical questions of using these new technologies to remake human reproduction or the human genetic code or to alter and augment our bodies and minds in various ways. You have this question of integrating technology with us in order to kind of bring us more into the virtual space, whether that's through the smartphone that we have now or eventually bringing those functions kind of and integrating them with human biology through a neural implant or something like that. And the questions that AI and these constructs sort of interacting with humans in various ways on a day-to-day basis now are starting to raise. But then, the post-liberalism thing and the economics thing, I think, also came in because, I really saw post-liberalism as challenging kind of a late-stage degenerate liberalism that had reached the point where it was all about maximizing individual autonomy, about the state and society being neutral on questions of what is the good for humanity, like what does human flourishing look like? Can society take a side in the question of whether it's better to, get married and have children and try to raise them to be virtuous members of society, versus whether it's better to sit at home watching porn and ordering DoorDash all day. Um, and kind of a late stage degenerated liberalism would say no, the society has no place to say that one lifestyle is better than the other. We just want people to have freedom and autonomy, right? And then the same thing with the economic side, where is the purpose of our economic life just to maximize everyone's consumption, maximize everyone's choice, maximize the growth of the GDP, make the line go up on the chart? Or can we say no, our economic life should be aimed at some idea of human flourishing the same way our political life should? And if so, what is that idea of human flourishing and how do we know? And if you say that we can't know or that there is no such thing as a standard of human flourishing we should aim at, then you've adopted a transhumanist mindset. And then on the religious angle, there was all kinds of directions to go in. There's all these strange overlaps between transhumanism and Satanism. between transhumanism and stories of the Nephilim in the Old Testament that we can talk about more later. Um, and then there's all these kind of transhumanist spiritualities where people seem to be longing for some larger force that can kind of bootstrap humanity into a higher state of consciousness or existence.
Right, right.
So there was a lot there, and I had a lot of fun writing it. My goal with this book is to kind of walk people through the same epiphany I had that caused me to write the book, which is all of these things are connected. Transhumanism is a much bigger deal than you probably think. It's far more advanced than you probably think. It's not just a few kind of eccentric technophiles or Silicon Valley weirdos. Those people are sort of on the cutting edge of it, and they're the most honest about it, but the presuppositions that they're using to argue for these applications of technology are presuppositions that most modern people share. And I think the
Right.
first step toward resisting the encroachments of those technologies is to really inquire, to examine ourselves and to try and rid ourselves of those presuppositions, which are deeply anti-Christian and anti-human.
That's interesting that you mentioned that because it seems very reasonable that this kind of stuff needs to be regulated. As you mentioned, that at least purely having a utilitarian mindset, we have to see that, we have to see the dangers of this. I mean, there's ethical committees based on reason alone, obviously, we can see that this is going to destroy man. So you don't come at it as a pure, you don't like moralize a lot. In
Mhm.
the sense that you do the inductive method actually, like these are the effects that are going to happen too, which are attractive to many in the kind of like the more practical mindset. Like this is practically bad, right? So this is going to have tremendous effects.
Yeah, yeah, I try to kind of do both. Like I try to make kind of a moral, philosophical, and religious
Yeah,
argument.
yeah.
Because, obviously I'm a Christian. I believe in natural law. Um, I believe in all these things. I believe that there's a real Luciferian impulse, and in fact, I believe there's actual demonic influence behind transhumanism, behind this technology. But I also want to, yeah, give kind of a practical or even a utilitarian argument, which I don't necessarily even think is going to be sufficient ultimately, but I think it might be enough to give people pause and maybe cause them to look a little deeper and move toward those more profound explanations of why transhumanism is wrong. So, yeah, the utilitarian side of the argument is really just humanity comes with all these limitations and involves all this suffering and all these frustrations and things, but it works well enough. And if you kind of take all the barriers down, take all the guardrails off, you're not going to be the one ultimately in control of these technologies. Um, they're going to be deployed by people who don't have your best interests at heart and controlled by these people who don't have your best interests at heart, even if those technologies are kind of available to you as the individual consumer and you have some leeway in choosing whether or not to adopt them and how to apply them to yourself. Um, the idea that that will protect us is dangerously naive. The state, the market, the culture, the media, advertising, all of these institutions in society are very powerful and have the ability to nudge you and incentivize you to remake and reshape yourself in all kinds of ways for their profit and for their convenience. The idea that transhumanist technologies would only be abused in some kind of totalitarian state like communist China is, like I said, dangerously naive. We have the ability really to make society into this Procrustean bed, which I talk about in the book, where it's this Greek myth of this guy who has a bed, and instead of giving travelers a bed that fits them, he cuts or stretches these travelers, usually killing them in order to make them fit this one bed that he has. Um, and that's what we're really in danger of doing if we open the door to transhumanist technologies. Um, if certain societal systems prove to be unbearable for human beings, right now the option we have is to reform those societal systems.
Right.
Um, but once it becomes an option to alter people's genes or alter their neurochemistry or alter their bodies to better bear up under the social conditions, what we're doing is giving those social systems permission to become infinitely more inhuman. And we can just remake ourselves in order to fit that inhumanity. Uh, you know, and from there, there's no real limiting principle to that.
Yeah, I like how you in the book you kind of have a lens of, and I think we this is what we need to obtain, have a lens of seeing many different issues through this transhumanist lens. Like, so example, you were mentioning like biotech, which maybe we don't explicitly see it as biotech, like even contraception. You mentioned the first part of your book referring to the bodies. These the issues referring to bioethics, this is, the immorality is really based on a transhumanist spirit. Can you elaborate on that first part, which is really interesting? I never thought about, immorality and bioethics being transhumanist.
Yeah, so yeah, this is kind of the whole principle underlying the first section of the book, which is how this transhumanist mindset affects how we view our bodies. And what transhumanism really does here is it denies any idea of natural law, it denies an idea of human nature that you could find in Thomas Aquinas or trace all the way back through to Aristotle. And that some of these ideas are also present even in the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. But it denies this idea of human nature, which means it denies kind of the idea of humans as a union of body and soul, and then the idea that you can make inferences about how we ought to live from the types of beings that we are.
Mhm.
Um, that what we are as humans can tell us how we ought to live, that we ought to try to flourish as the kind of being that we are. A transhumanist would say, well, no, right? Like human beings evolved as the result of these unguided natural forces. Everything's in flux. The idea of human nature is just a linguistic abstraction. It's just an arbitrary label that we slap on the characteristics we observe about ourselves. There's no ought attached to the is, right? You can't make inferences about how we ought to live from the kind of beings we are because the kind of beings we are arose by accident, and those accidents of evolution have no claim upon us. So what you end up with is humanity gets defined as kind of this free floating autonomous will. The will or the individual desire is given the central place, as opposed to this kind of older Christian idea of the union of body and soul, and of human nature as a thing that we're meant to kind of live in accord with. Um, and once you've kind of deified the individual will in that way, it leads to this transhumanist view of the body and of the purpose of medicine. So, what do I mean by that? Basically, historically, the purpose of medicine was to take what was broken and fix it. And to have those concepts, it seems obvious, but to have those concepts, you need to know what a healthy and whole human being looks like. You need to have a standard that you can apply and that you can hold up and say, okay, this person is not healthy, right? Your arm is supposed to bend like this, your arm is bending like this, and that's scary and bad, and we're going to put it in a splint or set the bone and fix it. Um, Today we've kind of lost that idea of medicine as being teleological, as kind of aiming at a standard of human flourishing that aligns with the kind of beings that we are as humans. So instead, the purpose of medicine becomes catering to the will or the desires of the patient, which in some cases looks the same, right? Like if you're in pain, you don't want to be in pain anymore. You go into the doctor and say, "Fix my arm." He fixes your arm the way he would have at any point in the last 300 or 5,000 years or whatever, assuming he knew how to do it. But when you put to questions like birth control, contraception, it's a world of difference, because what you're saying when you get on contraception is my monthly cycle is proceeding normally, is it's a woman who has a healthy monthly cycle, and she wants the doctor to give her something that will break it and disrupt it, so it'll take what's working and break it instead of taking what's broken and fixing it. And that's a huge departure from what the purpose of medicine ever was. Same thing with abortion. Your body is healthily gestating a baby the way it's supposed to, and in accordance with the woman's desires, she says, I want you to induce premature labor, or I want you to go in with instruments and kill this baby, um, because I no longer consent to provide sustenance to it. Uh, these are all bioethical questions that sort of have the same root, which is this transhumanist view of the human being as this disembodied will that really devalues our embodiment.
That's really fascinating, and actually, that was an eye opener reading how the evolution, or actually devolved into of medicine, becoming instead of enhancing the natural, helping the natural, aiding the natural. Essentially, it's now we see the natural as something that we need to kind of fix, which is
Mhm.
a totally warped mentality. It's really
Yeah, and people will, the biggest pushback that I get on this book, and it doesn't matter how many times you try to head this off, you still get this pushback from kind of technophiles or transhumanist types, is that you're just a Luddite, you just don't like technology. If you lived millions of years ago, you'd be saying that, we can't sharpen sticks, we need to throw rocks. Uh, all of these things,
yeah,
which I don't think is the case at all. And I think that's kind of an absurd argument to make because there's a real qualitative difference between using technology to facilitate human flourishing
right,
and to, you know, increase our ability to fix things when they get broken, and to kind of serve the ends of human flourishing, and using technology, turning it around back on ourselves and remaking the kind of beings that we are.
right.
So you can make very easy distinctions here. Transhumanists think that they can kind of catch you out on things, but if you think through the examples they're giving you, it becomes very obvious that you're not talking about the same thing. So one is like, oh, well, a prosthetic hand is transhumanist, and I would say, well, no, I don't think it is.
Right,
A
right,
prosthetic hand, the purpose is to replicate the function and the form of the lost organ. It's to, as best we can with medical science, uh, restore the human, like we said, to that standard of health and of flourishing that we believe is proper to humanity.
right,
Um, if I replaced my lost hand with a laser gun, we can talk about transhumanism. You know,
right,
if a
right,
pirate gets a blunderbuss instead of a peg leg, we can talk about transhumanism. But if you're trying to replicate what's been lost, if you're, getting a knee replacement or an artificial pacemaker, these are all wonderful inventions that I'm very happy about. And I'll go a step further. I am fine with, and the Catholic Church has said that it is fine with using gene editing to correct genetic disorders in utero. So if you're able to detect Down syndrome, for example, in a baby in utero, or trisomy or something like that, and there's a gene therapy that can take that baby's genetic code in utero and change it to be normal, the genome of a normal and healthy human being, the Catholic Church says, fine, go ahead and do that because, again, everything's rooted in this idea of human nature, human flourishing.
yeah. That when I read that,
What you can't do
oh, I'm sorry, go
is
ahead.
take that genetic code and try to augment it or alter it in extrinsic ways, um, that don't have to do with fixing something that's broken.
Right, right. The whole question with the human flourishing is a beautiful principle, but now the application of the principles, as Thomas Aquinas said, it could get a little difficult when we get into concrete issues. I like what you said about technology, because actually, classically speaking, technology is an imitation of nature. So it's like you cannot be totally divorced of nature, because then you have something else. And I think that's where you're going with the transhumanism. You give it that negative connotation. Correct me if I'm wrong. You give it which it has. Um, but regarding the principles, the application of the principles, for example, and I think this is where Pope Leo is kind of going to guide the church, God willing, like augmentations. So if there's augmentations, obviously for therapeutical purposes, fine and good, right? Pacemaker, but augmentations that are just for aesthetics, or augmentations that are just arbitrary, like,
Mhm.
I don't know, getting a third arm. Now, obviously, according to
Yeah.
that would be transhumanist, right? That would be transhumanist. But
Mhm.
then
Yeah.
doesn't it get like, isn't there a fine line of like, can't there be enhancements that are not necessarily transhumanist? Like, couldn't it kind of get kind of murky when we get to the concretes? Like, for example, fixing a gene that would help, neurological function or something like that.
Mhm. Yeah, so this is the argument of like, well, okay, what about, yeah, this is where you kind of can get death by a thousand cuts of like, well, okay, what counts as a disorder, right?
Right,
ADHD is an example I give in the book where this isn't actually a disease per se. It doesn't have kind of a diagnosable cause. It's diagnosed based on observations, and basically the observation is like, oh, you're just, two standard deviations to the left when it comes to hyperactivity. You're in the top, 10th percentile or whatever it would be. To me, I wouldn't view that as a disorder. Um, I would say if you're falling kind of within the bell curve of the range of abilities that a normal, healthy human being has, then I don't think the option should be there to augment yourself in certain ways.
right,
Because I think that that quickly becomes kind of a vicious cycle. One of the examples I lay out in the book is, let's say there's a pill that you can take that gives you an extra 70 IQ points or something.
right,
Um, and it costs a ton of money. Uh, it costs $20,000 a month or something. So immediately the super rich all get their kids on this pill. And suddenly a huge gap opens up between them and everyone else. Now, all the spots at the top universities are theirs, all the best job placements are theirs. They already had an advantage due to their family connections and their wealth and things, and now they have this huge neurological advantage. Um, so very quickly, what I imagine would happen in a situation like that is policymakers would get together and say, this kind of stratification isn't acceptable. So what happens now? Well, the pill is now covered by insurance. Pass a law mandatory. The brain pill is now covered by insurance. So now everyone has an extra 70 IQ points. And now what happens to people who won't take the pill? Um, some people don't have insurance, right? Okay, now the pill's free, right? Now it's free to use, free to cost, free, no cost to user for everyone. But what happens to people who won't take the pill? Now suddenly they are an underclass in society. They are basically excluded from the mainstream of society. They're kind of on par with the Amish now, right? They're, me and my descendants are over here and we are just dumb as rocks compared to everyone else in society. We are too stupid to hold down a job in the modern economy. Uh, what happens to us? I don't know. Maybe the state will deign to support us on welfare for a while. Maybe eventually they will leave us to starve. Who's to say? But I think that this pattern would repeat itself in many ways once you open the door to transhumanist technologies. One thing I talk about is artificial wombs and
yeah,
surrogacy, which right now surrogacy is kind of this very ugly example of wealth inequality, where you have very rich women who are able to outsource the labor of pregnancy and childbirth to poorer women,
right,
often in foreign countries. And everyone sort of looks at that and kind of cringes. But the sort of the solution to that, unless you want to just abolish the practice of surrogacy, which I don't see happening anytime soon, I wish it would, but the next step would be something like an artificial womb, which they've been tested on animals. They're not quite there yet, but they'll probably get there at some point. And again, they would probably be very expensive at first, and you'd have this very uncomfortable period in history where wealthy women are kind of sitting at brunch, FaceTiming their fetus while they drink mimosas over in the baby warehouse, and then poor women are still getting preeclampsia and gestational diabetes and dying in childbirth. And so very quickly it would be okay, baby gestation pods covered by insurance, free to everyone, universal basic baby pod. Um, and now again, the human species has undergone a shift now, right? We the way we reproduce, which is a key characteristic of any organism, is now different. And those who refuse to adopt this new technology are now deeply stigmatized. Pregnant women, a visibly pregnant woman walking down the street in a society like that would be regarded with disgust. She would be viewed as a crazy religious fanatic who's needlessly endangering herself, probably needlessly endangering her child by growing it in her own body rather than under controlled laboratory conditions. Um, And I think you'd see a lot of this. You'd see people kind of gradually being forced out of society. Another example would be like if you had a neural implant that allowed for an augmented reality overlay. So this is just kind of overlaying virtual elements over top of what you're already perceiving with your senses.
Yeah.
Um, so
I
we could easily get to a point where you can't navigate public space without an implant like that. You could get to a place where all the signs, on the road and in the town around you and stuff are blank to unaugmented eyes and are just updated as text boxes in virtual reality. So imagine like this is kind of terrifying, actually. It seems like something out of the Twilight Zone, but you're walking around town or an airport or driving down the road and you see signs everywhere and they're just blank. You can't navigate public space in this way. Um, and I think that's really what's coming for people who refuse to adopt some of these transhumanist technologies. And I think we need to be prepared for that.
Yeah, so I love how you have the deductive and the inductive approach, and obviously our main approach, obviously in a sense, it is deduction because natural law, reason, and faith. But I think you are speaking to today's modern man today that almost do not care for natural law. It is even negated. But this consequentialist approach, I think, is very apt for today. Saying, listen, this is what's going to happen. This is coming. And you even hear the likes of like Elon Musk calling for regulation of AI and things like this. But these so-called futurists, which is kind of like a scary elitist group, they kind of want unchecked, if we can do it, let's do it. Uh, access or ability to modify to make up all this technology. Yeah, it's really fascinating and it's scary. So I think that approach it talks to today's man, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah, well, I think ultimately recovering natural law in some form is our only way forward because otherwise we're going to be caught between
Yeah.
these techno optimists who have some vague idea that this could go too far, but they have no idea where or how to draw a line.
Hmm.
Um, and then you'll have kind of technophobes who try to push back against this, probably unsuccessfully, but who again don't really know how or where to draw the line. And so they either are, frogs being slowly boiled, or they undermine their own cause by reacting against applications of technology that are actually perfectly legitimate. I actually had a chance to talk briefly to Peter Thiel, big time transhumanist, and this is basically what I said to him is like he's very worried that he's worried somewhat about the advance of technology, but he's more worried about the backlash of technology and sees the possibility for that to turn into some kind of totalitarian system that promises to save us from technology by controlling everything.
Oh, wow, interesting.
And I said, look, if you want to avoid both of these, the answer is natural law.
That's right.
The answer is let's create hard boundaries where technology can flourish and help us within these boundaries, but won't turn back around and eat us alive.
Right.
One example would be something like artificial wombs. I mentioned this earlier, how this has the potential to be this dystopian thing, but an excellent application of that technology would be if a woman goes into labor or is in a life-threatening pregnancy and has to have labor induced early on to save her own life, and the baby can't survive outside the womb. That's not considered an abortion. That's just considered treating both patients but knowing that the baby won't survive.
Right.
But in this case, the baby could survive. You could take a pre-viable fetus and transfer it from the mother's womb to this kind of artificial womb or pod or sac or whatever filled with, some kind of synthetic amniotic fluid and kind of a synthetic umbilical cord and all the rest and feed it nutrients until it reaches the point of viability. And now that tragedy is averted. That mother and the baby both get to live. Um, there have actually been feminists who pushed back on the development of artificial wombs because they're afraid that application of the technology would push back on their arguments for legal abortion. Um,
Interesting. Yeah.
because you could end your pregnancy, I'm doing air quotes, but you would still have a baby at the end, and they don't want that.
Right. Right.
Um,
Right. Yeah.
so this would be a great way to use artificial wombs, but unfortunately, in our society, we just don't have the philosophical resources to draw that line because we don't believe in natural law anymore.
Right.
There's this great image that Chesterton gives you, that Chesterton describes, where he says, like, imagine, there's an island in the middle of the sea. It's very small, and there's, 100-foot sheer drop cliffs on every side that go down to sharp rocks. You fall off, you're going to die. And then there's a bunch of children on the island, and there's a big fence around so they can't fall off. As long as the fence is there, they can play as rough as they want. They can run around and jump and roll in the grass and tackle each other and, play Marco Polo with their eyes closed, whatever they want to do. You take that fence away, and they're either going to keep playing like they were before and fall to their deaths, or you're going to come back and find them all huddled, terrified in the middle of the island, not playing anymore. And that's the situation we're in when we removed the fence that natural law provided.
Yeah, that's beautifully said because it's the church that provides the parameters, but many think it's such a rigid view where they tell you what to believe, and
Mhm.
it's not the case at all. There's a lot of
Mhm.
leeway, there's a lot of pluralism, and there's flourishing ultimately
Mhm.
with humanity and kind of technology within that. So yeah, I mean
Yeah.
but so the consequentialist kind of uh, talking about the consequences, but as a means to point to natural law, I
Yeah.
guess
Mhm.
I think that's what you're essentially saying. Of
And
course.
my big hope for Leo's papacy is that we'll get from him an encyclical that's sort of part one of my book is bodies, and a lot of that is sort of stuff that would fall under Humana Vitae. What I'm hoping for from Leo's papacy is that we get the equivalent of that document for AI and virtual technology and neural implants and things like that. The stuff I cover in part two, the reality section.
Yeah,
Um, so I'm
maybe on
really
an
looking, I
anniversary.
think he's going to write an encyclical like that, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. That'd be awesome. If we can briefly, because I know the time, and it's not a brief topic at all, because
No.
we have to skip the politics. Maybe we can have you in a near future video. If I know you're a busy guy, but that would be great. But just kind of the digital Christianity, the spiritual, the techno spirituality is you see it as a technological substitute, actually.
Mhm.
Um, how we become discarnate because
Mhm.
of technology. What is this exactly? What's going on? What is this? And you even talk about digital worship. So what is it
Yeah.
about?
Yeah, so I think the Catholic Church has a, sort of antibodies against this due to the emphasis that it places on the sacraments, on, physical bread and wine, physical laying on of hands, physical water, all of this stuff. But I think that when you depart from that high view of the sacraments, as many Protestants do, you end up in this place where the faith becomes largely about kind of the imparting of information. Um, and that's something that doesn't involve us as incarnate beings. That does involve us just as kind of disembodied minds. And I think that as we introduce more kind of virtual and digital elements into worship, um, I think that that's making us increasingly discarnate. You have to ask yourself, like, is there a reason not to just hold all worship services in, the metaverse? And I think that, we saw a lot of that during the pandemic. Um, there's been a shift there where a lot of most churches started offering, remote worship during that time, that you could like live stream. And that led to some interesting dynamics. So, there were the live stream kind of separates you from the people there. You can pause it and hit play again. You could watch it back later and not really be united with people in time or in space. Um, you So a lot of them, some churches kind of scaled back or discontinued their live stream services after the pandemic ended, but some just kept them going. And there's a non-negligible percentage of churchgoers who, if not every Sunday, then at least maybe once a month or so, are skipping going to church and just doing the live stream. And then even when you go to church, there are elements that serve to kind of discarnate you and pull you away. So specifically, I talk about the use of screens. I draw a lot on Marshall McLuhan here, but the screens really kind of sort of work to yeah, they work to discarnate you in this way where what's on the screens sort of points you to this kind of surrounding virtual or electronic reality that's around you, that's coming through this screen, and it sort of works at cross purposes to what we talk about in the what like the Sanctus is about, which is that you're worshiping in the presence of the angels and saints. Um, this is kind of hard to distill, but I talk about it in the section, and if you read the book, you'll hopefully get a better version of the argument that I'm giving right now. But Yeah, it's something to watch out for, I think.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I guess there'll be a fine line to what you attribute because I don't know if you would call transhumanists like having QR codes for donating. My church just put these stickers on the
Mhm.
pews for the QR codes to donate. So, yeah, but that would not be transhumanist as opposed to what do you think about like using a digital? I've seen this an iPad as a missile for during the
Mm.
mass. The iPad. It was an iPad placed on an altar. I don't know if it was a pillow or a stand, but it was inclined and
Yeah.
it was used during the mass. It
Well,
had
there's a
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, there's an interesting thing with those screens where one thing I talk about in the book with tablets is there were these two ads that came out within a few weeks of each other, one in the first second in response to the first, where Apple put out an ad for its new iPad, and basically you had this stage with all of these objects on it, musical instruments, art supplies, paints, easels, sculpting materials, books, uh, arcade cabinets, VHS tapes, all these different types of physical media and physical implements. And then a hydraulic press comes down and crushes all of it into nothing. And then the hydraulic press lifts up and there's one iPad underneath it. The idea being that like all of physical embodied tactile reality, um, the feeling of the brush over the canvas, your fingers turning the pages, your the guitar strings thrumming, all of that gets crushed and placed into this machine that can simulate all of it, and that is sort of this all-purpose device. Uh, Samsung actually put on an ad. This ad was criticized a lot, thankfully, and Samsung put out an ad in response to it where someone comes to a set that looks much like the set that was destroyed by the hydraulic press and picks up a guitar that's been cracked a little bit but is still playable and picks it up, puts her Samsung tablet on a stand and pulls up sheet music on it and plays the guitar, which I think is a really useful kind of heuristic where it's like, are these devices kind of replacing or supplanting our ability to interact with the world around us? Are they making us discarnate? Are they making us less present? Or are they being used as a tool that can deepen our engagement
Right.
with the world around us in certain ways? So yeah, the question of using tablets in worship, I think, kind of comes down to that. As an interesting kind of bit of trivia, the Eastern Orthodox churches have had a big discussion about whether you can use tablets for icons. Uh, because from their perspective, once you put an icon on something, it should remain an icon.
Mhm.
Actually, for a long time, you weren't allowed to film inside of Orthodox churches because if you're using physical film, right, the process imprints that image on the film, and then that's projected on a screen. So the screen has an icon on it for a minute, and then it goes away. And they would say no, like whatever medium you're displaying the icon on, whether it's wood or canvas or whatever, like that should be what it is.
Right.
Um, it should be kind of consecrated to that use. It shouldn't be the case that the same screen that you watch Friends or pornography or whatever on should be also displaying this icon.
Yeah,
Uh,
they have a like a quasi-sacramental almost application to the icons, which is really fascinating. Yeah, no, it's tremendous. There is a pushback though, it seems that, and I'll give you the last word. I'll just say there's a pushback. I read an article that Gen Zers of the younger ages there are buying records. Records.
mhm,
So they're looking for what's tangible. They're looking for what's grounded. They're tired of like they see the digital as kind of fake in a
mhm.
sense. So there seems already to be kind of like the tide is turning essentially, where people want what the physicality of things. They want a book.
Yeah,
I think so. Hopefully, I think that's a good sign, in a
yeah.
sense. But
Well,
definitely, yeah,
yeah, and I'll take the last word to comment on that, which is
yeah,
just that I think there is a high degree of resentment among younger generations, even if it doesn't necessarily translate into action in terms of like, I'm going to delete my social media and get rid of my phone. I think many of them are still phone zombies, but they have some understanding that something is being done to them and they resent what it is. They resent this thing that's being done to them. there was a great article, I think, in an Australian publication where this girl was saying like, "Look, I was on my phone for 9 hours yesterday. What was I doing? Like, why am I allowed to do this?" And I think that's a good question, and I think that goes to the political angle that I was talking about earlier, which is, well, if it's all just like, the company provides a service and you use the service, it's a consensual transaction, da 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 da. Like the state is not involved in defining what human flourishing is, uh, then you can't really object to this per se, even though the devastation it's causing is obvious. Teen suicide rates and rates of mental illness go way up at the same time that there's the mass adoption by high schoolers and middle schoolers of smartphones. There's social contagions. The transgender movement has a lot to do with this. Um, and it's very, very destructive. People, kids aren't, taking risks. They aren't getting jobs. They aren't dating. They aren't getting their driver's licenses. They're just really turning into these kind of discarnate phone zombies. And there have been efforts in some states to actually ban minors from social media and ban minors from using smartphones. And I think that one of the most concrete things we can do to push back against transhumanism right now is to support those efforts. Um, to kind of say that, and this is, there's libertarian think tanks that I quote and talk about in the book that'll say like, oh, well, this is a choice for each family to make, and this is, about individual freedom, and we don't want the government telling people how to, so on and so forth. But I think it's actually a huge step forward for recovering some idea of natural law and of a society oriented towards some kind of authentic human flourishing, to be able to say, no, it's better for my child to have a childhood where they're with their family, physically and mentally present, kind of imbibing their values from their family, uh, playing outside, getting their driver's license, asking out a girl or a guy, um, and being mentally and physically healthy, as opposed to having their dopamine systems and their very plastic brains and attention spans strip mined for profit by companies that are demonstrably harming them. Like, it should be, this is the bare minimum here. Can we say that option A is better than option B, and that we should have more of A and less of B? If we can answer that, there's maybe some hope. If we just throw up our hands and say, "Oh, I can't even tell the difference. These are equally valid," it's like, oh, we might be cooked.
Yeah, that's why I like that in the beginning how you talked about post-liberalism, because this extreme libertarianism is kind of there is a pushback towards that, because like, come on, you can't just leave, kind of, there has to be some basic moral
Mhm.
regulations to this. So for sure. Well, guys, get the book, the link on the bottom. If you have any websites, Grayson, just send me over. I'll put it in the description so you guys
Mhm.
can check it out. Get the book. It's definitely, for me, intellectual ammunition. I teach ethics at high schoolers, and they have questions, and you helped me answer a lot of the questions when I was reading this
Oh,
book. So I didn't
that's
finish
great
it
news.
totally, but I'm going to get to the end. And it's one of those books where I continue even after the interview. Sometimes when I have the interview, I just because I get ready for the next book. But this one is definitely I'm going to continue it and go back to it. I have it marked up and everything. So
Oh, it's high praise. Thank you. I'm honored.
yeah, we appreciate it. And yeah, thanks for coming on. Hopefully we'll have you on again
I
sometime.
appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Bless.
God bless.